Welcome back. North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs is warning about threats to your right to vote. That's because she went through a more than 6-month-long legal ordeal over her own election. In 2024, her opponent challenged 68,000 votes. Riggs was eventually certified after a federal court ruled in her favor. I spoke with Justice Riggs yesterday about that, as well as the hot-button issue of redistricting. You have litigation experience generally in the space of mid-session redistricting. Explain to my audience your thoughts about that. I know you can't comment as a member of the North Carolina Supreme Court on what's going on in Texas. I wouldn't ask you to. But in general, this process of politicians trying to find voters as opposed to voters voting for politicians.
So I was a voting rights attorney before I joined the bench. I litigated redistricting cases in Texas and North Carolina under the Voting Rights Act and under the Constitution, under the ideal that the federal Constitution shouldn't let politicians pick their voters. Mid-decade redistricting is particularly concerning because voters expect some sort of norms and to be able to predict who represents them and when. And we used to be in a much more regular cycle of there was a census every 10 years and lines were redrawn and those stuck for another decade.
And you knew who represented you and you knew who to contact for any issue that might arise.
That's right. I worked in redistricting cases and gerrymandering cases where the lines would crisscross across the street, and voters would see yard signs and say, well, that's not who represents me, and be very confused and ultimately concerned. And so the work that I'm doing on the bench as a constitutional officer, but also speaking out on attacks to democracy, that's why I'm speaking at a spotlight forum in front of the U.S. Senate today, is to make sure that people know that these threats to democracy, from gerrymandering to election denialism, these are very real threats. We keep having near misses in terms of constitutional crises, and I just cannot sit by legally or morally and not speak out when that's happening.
Your race in 2024, re-election, was the most litigated and most delayed certification of all the 2024 contests. When you were sworn in afterwards, you said $2 million was spent, time and money was wasted, and irreparable damage was done. Yet you won, you prevailed, the voters' will prevailed. So was that time wasted? Was that money wasted? Was irreparable damage done?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Isn't this how the system is supposed to work? And what I can tell you is I talked to thousands of voters after the election who were so confused. How could their vote for the presidential race count, but not the state Supreme Court? How could the rules that they understood them on Election Day be changed after the fact to decide whether or not their votes count? And I cannot give a satisfying answer to those questions. So no, the system is not intended to work this way. The system is designed that when we run for office, we accept that voters might not pick us, but we should, in an orderly, rules-based system, agree to be bound by the outcomes. And it would be tragic if the outcome had been different because I couldn't raise the money that I raised. It shouldn't be who can throw the most money at litigating an election outcome after the fact. That's not how a well-functioning democracy works.
And your race was emblematic of challenges also that surfaced in 2020. And I want my audience to think about this for a second, because you said something that's vitally important that I think gets glossed over. In 2020 and in your election, other races on the ballot were accepted as valid, meaning the procedures were accepted as valid. What was thought to be invalidated was a result within an accepted range of procedures. And that's different than saying there was a fundamental flaw in the process that prevented someone from getting their due process rights or their voting rights processes respected constitutionally.
That's right. This was a selective targeting of a race where disgruntled partisans and disappointed candidates didn't like the outcome in that one race. And I cannot find a way to help explain to voters why it is so that you can just pick and choose which elections you're going to accept the results of, because there is no good explanation.
And in your case, there were questions raised by about a batch of votes that were cast, some by military and some by overseas voters, but those objections were not lodged against a result of any other race on that ballot.
And they weren't lodged against every military voter statewide. It was military voters in 4 heavily Democratic counties. We have 100 counties. So not only was it challenging the rights to vote of people who raised their hand to serve our country bravely, but it was treating those voters differently based on where they registered. And I talked to voters who were deployed in war, were serving in Europe on submarines, on bases in Washington and Kansas. These are folks who were so confused about what they needed to do and if they could even fix it months after the fact. And our service members and their families deserve better than that.
In your history, you also litigated a case involving efforts to make sure that voter rolls are up to date. That often falls under the rubric of election integrity by some who argue in this space. Help my audience understand the necessity of accurate voter rolls, but how litigation there can often create more heat than light.
Yeah. We have been lucky in North Carolina to have a history of great election administration, and I've seen nationally groups do a lot of work to make sure that states are communicating with each other about people moving from state to state. We want our voter registration rolls to be correct, and we don't want any ineligible voters to get pushed off the ballot, pushed off the voter rolls because of an administrative error. In the run-up to my election, we saw pre-election litigation challenging voter rolls in North Carolina because allegedly some voters were missing information like their driver's license or social security number. I'll give you an example because my father was one of those people. He served for 30 years in uniform, was deployed in war. He went to register to vote with his retired military ID. So it obviously doesn't have a driver's license number on it. The DOD decided years ago to take social security numbers off of military IDs for security reasons. Not only did he use a valid form of ID to register to vote, he presented a valid form of ID every time he voted subsequent. So in all of this dispute, my opponent couldn't point to one ineligible voter on the rolls. And this was the pre-litigation, litigation, and post-litigation. And I want people to know that it's not just games. It can't just be gamesmanship. It's people like my father and his right to vote. Those are stories I want to tell so people understand that there aren't credible allegations of serious problems. There's gamesmanship involved.
Member of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Allison Riggs. I appreciate the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.